Hello everyone, welcome to A Star Psych, and today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics in abnormal psychology and psychopathology, and that is the schizo spectrum. But instead of just discussing the schizo spectrum and listing it out and its definitions and all the variables of it, I want to link it to something else near the end of the video, and that's going to be creativity. And I want to talk about the unique relationship that the schizo spectrum has with creativity as a trait. Now, when I start these types of videos, I'm going to give this disclaimer because it's very important for me to do so. I am not a licensed clinical psychologist or mental health professional, and everything discussed in this video is simply from an academic or discussion point of view. It is not going to be anything that you should take as any form of clinical advice or even as fact. This is more so meant to be a discussion on the schizo spectrum from someone who is a student of psychology. With that, let's get into it. So why is it called the schizo spectrum, and why aren't we just talking about things like exclusively schizophrenia, for example? Well, in the past 2 decades or so, there's been a movement in the clinical psychology and psychiatry fields to see most disorders as less categorical and more spectrum focused. So that is to say that you could have kind of a few traits of something, more traits of something, and that could differentiate how you experience this disorder that you have. So for example, autism is a great example of this. Autism in and of itself was taken out of the DSM-5 and replaced with autism spectrum disorder, which now recognizes that there is a lot of different variations of autism that one might experience based on their unique traits. So schizophrenia is exactly the same way, and the schizo spectrum actually starts out with a few different lesser disorders that display some of the traits that you might see in schizophrenia without some of the more severe symptoms or traits. The beginning of the schizo spectrum actually starts with cluster A personality disorders. Now, personality disorders are primarily divided into 3 different clusterings of the traits associated with them, but today we're going to be talking about cluster A, which is paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. We'll come back to paranoid later, but schizoid personality disorder is usually seen as the kind of entry level to the schizo spectrum, as in this is what most would see as the lowest entry point for having something on the schizo spectrum. So what is schizoid personality disorder? Well, schizoid personality disorder is marked by extreme introversion as well as a general aloofness and flat emotional affect. So people with schizoid personality disorder are very flat emotionally. They don't express much. They're usually not interested in any form of social interaction. They may not even experience social anxiety related to social interactions, though. It's almost like they're just strongly disinterested in social interaction in and of itself. They're usually likely to turn down social events, and they find it hard to find pleasure in things. So the primary thing here is that the schizoid personality disorder is often disassociated from kind of the social environment. They are their own extremely individual, independent person who doesn't even feel like they need to have normal social human connections that most people would feel like they need to have. Now, if you're someone who's extremely introverted, you might have related to some of the things that I just said. You would be like, oh my goodness, do I have schizoid personality disorder? I'm kind of like this. The difference here is that the schizoid personality disorder is something that kind of goes beyond just extreme introversion, and that it's very hard for them to even find pleasure in daily activities. So there's usually something neurochemical, physiological going on that can't always be fully explained by just full-on preference for introversion. It's not uncommon to see critiques of schizoid personality disorder, though, and there are psychologists and psychiatrists who think that it is just extreme introversion and that it shouldn't be considered a form of disorder and that it may just be someone who is very introverted. And where do we draw the line between someone who's just like 99.9th percentile introversion and where they have an actual disorder? Is it a problem for them? These sorts of things. It can be hard to tell, and it can be hard to diagnose and classify. So the real entry point for the schizo spectrum, when you start seeing things that start to get weird and almost more so mentally disassociative, is the next disorder. This is going to be schizotypal personality disorder, and this is what I would consider personally to be the real entry point for a schizo disorder. And why is that? Why would I see this as more of an entry point for the schizo spectrum than schizoid personality disorder? Well, schizotypal is more so marked by imaginative or unrealistic ways of thinking. They may believe things that aren't inherently true. They tend to get caught up in their own fantasies. So for example, it's not uncommon for schizotypal patients to maybe have an imaginary friend that they genuinely believe to be real, or believe that they're part of some sort of association or grouping that isn't actually real. They have magical thinking is what it's called. And this can sometimes accumulate in feelings of grandiosity that usually doesn't border on to the extremes of something like narcissistic personality disorder, but they can come to conclusions about themselves and others through these magical thoughts that aren't a real representation of reality. Now, this doesn't usually border on the realm of paranoia, in that schizotypal patients usually are somewhat functional in society, and we usually think of them more so as eccentric than a danger to themselves, or maybe even anxious about the world around them. They might misread social cues and situations because of their magical beliefs. They might think that you have some ability that you don't have. There's a lot of different ways the schizotypal personality disorder can present itself, but it's important to remember that the key marking here is that there is magical thinking included with this disorder, compared to schizoid personality disorder, which does not have magical thinking. Now we move up the line to what is almost schizophrenia. In fact, it's pretty much just schizophrenia, and this is called Schizophreniform disorder. And this is essentially just schizophrenia that's existed for less than 6 months in a patient. And why is it important to make a distinction here? Why is it important how long someone has had a disorder or has been displaying traits? Because schizophrenia-like traits could be onset by something else in someone's life that may only be temporary. So for example, in response to an extremely traumatic event, someone might experience or present schizophrenic-like symptoms temporarily while their mind is kind of like recovering from this event. So we have this distinct classification to make sure that we're noting that it's not just some form of temporary thing in this person's life. And once it progresses beyond the 6 months mark, that's when we can say, okay, this is more likely to be actually schizophrenia as opposed to something that may just be displaying aspects of schizophrenia. So now we move on to schizophrenia, and schizophrenia actually isn't the end of the schizo spectrum. There's one more disorder beyond this that we need to talk about, but we have to talk about schizophrenia first before we can get to that one. So schizophrenia becomes separated from schizoid and schizotypal personality disorders in that it is no longer a personality disorder, and it is now considered a severe mental health issue or disease in some cases. So what is the distinction there? Well, a personality disorder is usually something that is seen as a long-lasting, reoccurring pattern of cognition that is going to be present throughout someone's life, and usually it's not something that you can get rid of, but you can generally work with it, get therapy, these sorts of things, and be relatively functional in society if you work really hard. Although it depends, because some people are not going to be able to be as functional as others. But think of personality disorders as less severe versions of severe mental health issues or disease, somewhere in between something lower end like baseline anxiety and severe mental health issues. You're going to find that middle ground of personality disorders, which tend to be lifelong. The difference, again, is that schizophrenia is more so a brain disease. Most psychiatrists and psychologists, at least according to the research that I was able to find, refer to schizophrenia as a disease of the brain as opposed to something more akin to a personality disorder. And what does that mean? Well, it means that there's going to be a much stronger biological or physiological aspect to schizophrenia compared to something like a personality disorder. And that's why you're going to find that the traits of schizophrenia may be more severe or even harder for a patient to deal with because their body may literally be betraying them in some sense. So what are the primary characteristics of schizophrenia? Well, one of them is going to be hallucinations, and this is kind of the one that you think of when you think of schizophrenia in like movies and stuff. You think of the person who's crazy. They can't separate their thoughts from reality. And this can be seen as an extreme version of the magical thinking that I discussed earlier when talking about schizotypal personality disorder, in that those who have hallucinations are experiencing a form of magical thinking that is even more extreme. It's harder for them to disassociate from the rest of the world, to dissociate from reality. It's harder for them to make the distinction between those two, excuse me. And that level of delusion can be something that is extremely impairing to someone who has this disorder, whereas the person or patient who has schizotypal personality disorder may have magical thinking that is relatively functional within their reality. Hallucinations tend to be so extreme that it's hard for someone to be functional when they have such extreme versions of magical thinking, or their perceptions are so realistic that they can't differentiate them in the slightest, or they impact them in such a way that they can't even tell what is happening. So hallucinations, delusions, and then disorganized speech and disorganized behavior are other key characteristics of schizophrenia. So people who, their thoughts and mind are kind of so scattered that they're unable to keep basic things in order. So for example, they might have a hard time keeping up to date with bills. They might have a hard time keeping their house clean. And it's not because they might not want to do these things. It's because their mind may be so disorganized that they can't put the order of events that they need to do to get these things done in the right order. So they might find themselves kind of randomly jumping between things that they feel like they need to do. And this can all be influenced again by things like hallucinations and delusions, which can interfere with the thought process that they might have that is healthy. So say, for example, they want to get something done and they get started, then they experience a delusion of some kind that prevents them from finishing this single activity. Another key trait is going to be, much like schizoid and schizotypal personality disorder, there's going to be what's called negative symptoms. And a negative symptom is when something is taken away from a person as opposed to added. So for example, flat affect is a negative symbol because you are missing affect or missing emotion, so therefore it is negative. It is being taken away from you. So there are going to be negative symptoms like flat affect associated with schizophrenia. And the other key and pretty much final thing that's going to be present is all of this needs to culminate in the individual having this disorder for more than 6 months, but also it needs to be interfering with their functionality in such a way that they can't function, because that really is what defines a disorder, is their inability to function given the things or the issues that they are facing, especially socially. You're going to find a lot of social dysfunction with patients who are schizophrenic because it's hard for them to communicate with others when they have delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized speech. And other people are usually going to see schizophrenic patients as extremely eccentric. And from an intuitive level, when we look at somebody who displays very eccentrically or weird, you're going to notice that your kind of body's self-defense mechanisms might spark up. Like when you view that type of person, you may have even seen like a homeless person on the street with a mental health disorder, and your body's adrenaline might even kick in because you're not exactly sure what to expect or how to read this person. You would likely have similar experiences when you're interacting with someone who has schizophrenia, because it's impossible to predict consistent patterns in their behavior because of the disorganization of their speech and thinking. The end point of the schizo spectrum is going to be schizoaffective disorder. And schizoaffective disorder is essentially going to be schizophrenia plus a mood disorder, such as severe depression. There's a few different mood disorders, but schizoaffective is going to be schizophrenia plus a mood disorder. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about that because I feel like we spent a lot of time on schizophrenia, and I'd like to get to the later points in the video. The one thing I do want to talk about schizophrenia before we skip on to the next part is the age of onset. So most people who develop schizophrenia tend to develop it around the age of 20, and that if you look at the statistics of onset age, it really spikes around 20. And it's really interesting. I know that's kind of a weird word to say when you're talking about a mental health disorder, but it's an interesting pattern that most people develop, or it becomes more present at the age of 20, and that you can have children who are almost perfectly normal all the way up until age 20, and then like snap, something activates and now they have schizophrenia and they're experiencing delusions and, you know, hallucinations, magical thinking, these sorts of things. And it's hard because psychiatrists, psychologists don't know exactly what happens. And if it is a brain disorder, you know, you could make the theory that the brain starts to finalize and fully develop around the age of 24. So as it approaches those final stages of evolution, maybe the trait associated cognitively with schizophrenia develops fully, and then you start to see those weird things happen. I'm not entirely sure, that's just a, you know, random theory that I'm throwing out, but it is interesting to know that the average onset age spikes really high around the age of 20 when it comes to schizophrenia and even schizoaffective disorder. So now I want to talk about the schizo spectrum and its relationship to creativity as a trait, and the weird relationship that it tends to have and how this displays in clinical patients. Now, I found this out last year when I was doing a practice literature review for schizophrenia for one of my graduate courses, graduate psychopathology, and I stumbled across one of the papers, and it's been in my backlog of things that I wanted to talk about for a while. I have three total papers here that kind of support this general idea, and I'm not going to read academic papers to you because that's going to take forever, but I wanted to just go over the kind of primary points that were found when it comes to these papers. And that one is that schizophrenia or schizotypal traits, those who present traits of the schizo spectrum, tend to have more creativity only when they are experiencing these traits to a level that is not the severe disorder. So let me go over what that means, because that's kind of jumbled. So when you look at someone who has traits of a disorder, they can present more than one trait. They can present the minimum amount of traits. So someone who has schizophrenia can present all of the traits, or they can present the bare minimum needed for a diagnosis. Someone who has schizotypal disorder could present all of the traits, or they could present only the minimal needed for that disorder. And that's going to make that person present more or less in a certain way, depending on the severity of the disorder and how many of those traits that they are presenting. But what researchers found was that there was a reverse U-shaped relationship when it comes to creativity for those who have schizotypal or schizo spectrum traits, meaning that as people got more traits on the schizo spectrum, they developed one or two things that might be related to the schizo spectrum. They found that creativity and creative achievement went up more compared to the average person. So those who present one or two traits of schizo spectrum disorders are likely to have slightly more creative ability or achieve more creatively than the average person who doesn't have those type of traits. But the interesting thing about this relationship, though, is that once you get to full-blown on schizotypal personality disorder and then further down into schizophrenia, you find that this climbing of creative ability and achievement drops down. And that's why you get this what's called a reverse U-shaped relationship, where essentially it goes up and then it goes down as you approach and get more of these traits. So you initially get creativity from the traits, and then you lose the creativity or the ability to express that creativity as the traits develop further into a disorder. And to me, that was something that I thought was really interesting, because when you look at schizophrenic patients, when you look at people who have schizotypal personality disorder, in movies you often see this archetype of someone who's crazy, but they express this creativity or this craziness even through their art. You know, they have the drawings on the walls of these things that they're seeing inside of their head, and they have these vivid images. And the difference is that when you look at these studies, especially the study in the graph that I'm going to be showing on screen, you'll notice that it's creative achievement as opposed to creativity as a single metric in and of itself. And what that means is that the person who is highly schizophrenic or presents full-on schizophrenia as a disorder may be just as creative as the person below them, maybe even more so, but their ability to express that creativity to the outside world is going to be lost because of the dysfunction that comes with their disorder. So it makes you wonder, is there really this kind of strong link with schizophrenia and creativity? Well, universally, other papers have shown that no, not every schizophrenic patient is going to have strong levels of creativity. But what they did find is that those who did have creative ability and were diagnosed with schizophrenia were likely to have a more functional outcome when it comes to their ability to interact with the world. So schizophrenic patients who were experiencing delusions, hallucinations, all of these things, who were also creative, who had creative abilities, were able to function slightly better, even to a statistical level, than those who were not creative or showed lower levels of creativity. All right, everybody, this video is already a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, but I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on the schizo spectrum and its relationship to creativity. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. This is one of my favorite topics. I want to work with schizophrenic patients in the future when I eventually become a licensed clinical psychologist, hopefully in the future. So we shall see how things unfold over the next 5 to 10 years. But thank you so much for watching. I would like to remind people that I do have a Patreon if you'd like to support me in this channel. Even just $1 a month is a huge help. Other than that, I do have personality typing sessions as well as coaching available at my website, asurapsych.com, if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. This has been Asura from Asura Psych. Have a good one.